This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. Should an army of Americans ever march into the country, they will only have to march from province to province in triumph, and be hailed by the united voices of grateful millions as their deliverers and saviors, whilst our national character would be resounded to the most distant nations of the earth. Captain Zebulon Montgomery Pike, on the outcomes of an invasion of New Mexico and New Spain on April 12, 1808. This series over the little-known explorer and spy Zebulon Pike is the precursor to my upcoming massive Mexican-American War series. In 2026 America, few know the name and even fewer know the exploits of Zebulon Montgomery Pike. Yes, Pike's Peak is named after him in Colorado, although he never climbed to its actual peak. But besides that massive monument to the man, what else did his 1806 to 1807 mission to the American Southwest yield for the nation that had just purchased the vast territory of Louisiana from Napoleon? For starters, his book gave Americans the first description of the American Southwest, and that description fascinated the public at large. But that came later. This series will be in the same vein as the Dominguez and Escalante expedition as I follow the man and his brave men from start to finish, before describing his lasting impact on the soon-to-be American Southwest. But a quick note before I start. It's amazing we have anything at all from Zeb. First of all, the Spanish confiscated nearly everything, so what he wrote later was from memory, except for the few scraps he was able to squirrel away. And then, all of his regimental records were burned during the War of 1812 when the British burned D.C. And then again, all of his private papers were destroyed by a fire when his grandson's house burned to the ground. A lot of what we have comes from dusty records in Mexico City, when in 1907 or 1908, an American historian, Herbert E. Bolton, found Pike's original documents in the archives. He subsequently printed what he found, and he gave us a lot of the information we have today. Of course, copies of Pike's book survived over the years, but Zeb's story could very easily have been lost forever to history, like any number of records in the Library of Alexandria. But as usual, I plan on keeping his story alive through this series, and it's a good story. So grab your paddles, strap on your moccasins, and awaken your sense of exploration and intrigue as I take you from Missouri to the Rockies, down to Santa Fe, and then Chihuahua, Mexico, with the forgotten but exciting adventure of Zebulon Montgomery Pike. Thomas Jefferson had views of empire. He was the one to plant the seed of manifest destiny. He allowed for its birth, its growth. In 1809, Jefferson eloquently put this desire into words when he said, quote, "We should have such an empire for liberty as she has never surveyed since creation, and I am persuaded no constitution was ever before so well calculated as ours for extensive empire and self-government." End quote. Never mind that those two things can never go hand in hand. Even before the United States owned the enormous land that was Louisiana, with the Mississippi, Missouri, and all the other wonderful rivers, Jefferson was plotting. He once remarked that the United States would eventually take the lands of the Americas from Europe, quote-unquote, piece by piece. He also said in the 1780s that, quote, "Our Confederacy must be viewed as the nest from which all America, North and South, is to be peopled." End quote. Jefferson, even before becoming president, he was scheming on ways to explore what lay just beyond the 13 states, The Spanish, though, they knew of the threat of this new republic. In 1799, Lieutenant Jose Cortez would remark, quote, "The other nation that demands our vigilant caution and forces us to contain, in part, its expansion is the new power known as the Republic of the United Anglo-American Provinces. These states, which have risen so suddenly to such a colossal height, have extended to points so dangerously near and surrounded us so closely that we must fear the expansion of their borders over Louisiana and Florida, and their proximity to the province of Texas, where they can enter undetected." End quote. He was right to be fearful of the new nation's expansion. The Spanish would shortly after that quote by Cortez object flat out to Thomas Jefferson's face in 1802, when Jefferson asked for permission to send some scientific and mapping expeditions beyond the Mississippi River. Jefferson only wanted to explore all the way to the Pacific through their land for the quote-unquote advancement of the geography. That's all. If you could just ask your king, please. Spain's minister to the United States, he laughed this request away. He said, quote, "The president has been all his life a man of letters, very speculative and a lover of glory, and it would be possible he might attempt to perpetuate the fame of his administration by discovering the way by which the Americans may someday extend their population and their influence up to the coasts of the South Sea." End quote. And the South Sea is the Pacific Ocean. And that was Thomas Jefferson's plan. It wouldn't be long, though, before permission from the Spanish crown or even the French leader would be totally and completely unnecessary. And it was rather good timing, too. In reading for this series, I discovered that there was a very good chance we, the United States, would have taken, or at least attempted to take, New Orleans, the Mississippi River, and therefore most of Louisiana by force of arms. War, if Louisiana had not been sold to Jefferson and our nation in 1803. Another interesting piece of information I learned was Napoleon's answer to Jefferson's question over the boundary of Louisiana. Bonaparte said something to the effect of, "The boundary is whatever you make it." Jefferson's dream of an extensive empire of self-government was becoming realized. So what was the boundary of Louisiana in Jefferson's eye? It was, quote-unquote, the Rio Norte, or Bravo, a.k.a. the Rio Grande. Jefferson wanted Louisiana to include not only the Great Plains of the Missouri Riverlands, but all of Texas and the eastern half of New Mexico, including the cities of Albuquerque and Santa Fe. But of course that would be problematic, as La Villa Real de la Santa Fe de San Francisco de Asís was the capital of New Spain's Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico. To remedy this, Jefferson would eventually acquiesce and claim the Rio Grande to the Pecos River was the boundary. So Spain could keep Santa Fe and Albuquerque, but only just. All of this boundary dispute will get solved in 1819. But until then, tensions will be high between the United States and Spain, and then the United States and Mexico. But if only Jefferson and his administration and his generals, if only they knew what the land and the people and the Spanish army, what it all looked like in New Mexico and Texas. If only there was a way to ascertain the strength of Spain in that far-flung territory. Maybe the Rio Grande could be the boundary after all. Maybe even far beyond that. As Jefferson began arranging his 8 missions to the west after the purchase of Louisiana, some political intrigue was occurring surrounding a man named Wilkinson. A man whom Theodore Roosevelt would later say, quote, "In all our history there is no more despicable character." End quote. I think that's a little harsh, but you'll hear how it is pretty warranted. Wilkinson was an army man for the United States. He was a war hero. He had fought in the Revolutionary War. But he was also a highly paid spy for Spain. And at one point he even plotted to have Tennessee and Kentucky secede from the Union and join Spain. He also told Spanish officials of Jefferson's plans of exploration, and he suggested that the Spanish army intercept Lewis and Clark and arrest him. Now, this wasn't all his idea, though. This was part of something I'll talk about in a couple episodes, known as the Burr Plot, or Burr Conspiracy. Washington, Adams, Hamilton, and Jefferson, they were all aware of Wilkinson's deceit, but instead of punishing him, they kept Wilkinson happy and close by paying and promoting him. The man could, after all, do some real damage if he was ever let loose. Eventually, after the purchase, Jefferson even made Major General Wilkinson the governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory. Wilkinson's new headquarters would be in St. Louis. Amazingly, this entire time, Wilkinson had been plotting with men like Vice President Aaron Burr to have those two states secede and then invade Mexico, and create a brand new Mexican empire, which would include Louisiana, New Mexico, California, and New Spain. And of course, Wilkinson would be its emperor. Or maybe Burr, depends on who you ask. Wilkinson was certainly ambitious, but he was also a traitor, and he was a triple agent, working for America, Spain, and himself. But he did have his usefulness. Wilkinson would eventually give Jefferson a 22-page document, and this document included detailed maps of Louisiana and New Mexico, and the map included rivers, mountains, and towns. This map would be known as the Humboldt map, and it will become rather important in our story. Thankful for this information from Wilkinson, but unsure of what to do with the traitorous spy, Jefferson broke his own rule and gave the military man civilian control of the entirety of Upper Louisiana. Jefferson and many others in his administration figured if we give the man 2 salaries and vast amounts of power, maybe he'd finally settle his allegiances and be a true patriot. And this pretty much worked. Meanwhile, talks with Spain over the boundary fell apart when the Spanish flatly rejected the Pecos River proposal and then the second proposal of the Texas-Colorado River boundary. Spain was not going to give an inch to the United States. The war that would erupt 40 years later had its roots in the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson even hinted it himself when he said, quote, "I do not view peace as within our choice." End quote. I'm surprised the war didn't start in the first decade of the 19th century, honestly. James Monroe, founding father and future president, he was the one in talks with Spain over the boundary. And he told Jefferson that Spain would not give up its territory unless we took it by force. Monroe also told Madison, the Secretary of State, that the U.S. should use force to take the entire western continent to the Rio Grande. In response to this, Spain sent quite a few troops into Texas, all the way up to the Red River, the current boundary between Oklahoma and Texas. Spain also had warships awaiting in Cuba. If the U.S. wanted war, Spain would be ready. War, though, for now, would not be forthcoming, even if both nations were barreling towards it. Although a few adventurous Americans were indeed about to face down the barrels of Spanish guns, so to speak. After Thomas Jefferson purchased Louisiana from future Emperor Napoleon, the president sent a total of 8 expeditions to explore the vast newly acquired land. Of course, the most famous one is Lewis and Clark, which left in 1805. But an often overlooked expedition, actually 2 of them, were led by a young Army lieutenant named Zebulon Montgomery Pike. Although I should mention that Jefferson did not plan and authorize these missions. Instead, he left it up to Wilkinson, which would come to bite Pike in the butt after his adventure. Zeb Pike was born on January 5, 1779, in Trenton, New Jersey. His father, Zebulon Pike Sr., had been a major in the United States Army during the American Revolution. Senior Pike had also been close friends with General Wilkinson. And at 15 years old, Zeb Jr. would continue his family's legacy and he would join the Army. And then a few years later, in 1801, he would marry the daughter of another famous Revolutionary War captain. Her name was Clarissa Brown. Pike would call her Clara. And, well, yeah, I guess I should mention they are cousins. The two would have several children, but only one son and one daughter would survive the future explorer and military man. Zeb Pike was described as, quote, an efficient and zealous officer, strict in discipline and gentlemanly, and reserved in manner. He was studious, devoting his time to extending his military education, to reading, and to studying French. End quote. That quote was from Stephen Harding Hart, and he edited, along with Archer Butler Holbert, the Southwestern Journals of Zebulon Pike, 1806 to 1807. Their editions were printed in Colorado in 1932 and 1933. I have the 2006 republished and combined version with a foreword by Mark Lee Gardner of To Hell on a Fast Horse fame. That book, as well as the incredible Donald Jackson's edition of the journal, they were my main resources. Zeb was also described as being an officer of, quote, the first class, as esteemed from a superiority of genius and military proficiency, a combination almost guaranteeing retention and promotion, end quote. And this was said of him after Thomas Jefferson's mandatory evaluation of every officer in the military. Jefferson, unbeknownst to myself before studying this, once he took the office of Commander-in-Chief, he purged the military almost entirely of Federalists and those who politically opposed him. A smart move. And a little more about Zeb, I will quote a paragraph about his appearance from George R. Matthews. His book, Zebulon Pike, Thomas Jefferson's Agent for Empire, was fantastic. And yes, this is the George R. Matthews who wrote Billy the Kid, The Life Behind the Legend. It was published in 2016. Well, here's the quote about Zeb's appearance. Pike's appearance was described by a contemporary as military but somewhat peculiar. While standing in parade, he habitually leaned his head to the right until the tip of his bicorn touched his shoulder. His stature was about 5 feet 8 inches, tolerably square and robust for his age. His complexion was ruddy, eyes blue, light hair, and features good. A portrait painted by Charles Wilson Peale provides a few more details. His reddish, wavy hair is cut short and brushed forward at the sides in the style favored by young men at the time. His nose is rather prominent, and his full lips contrast oddly with his steady gaze. He has a high forehead and a firm chin, and he is much better looking in the original portrait than in the subsequent engravings made from it. End all quotes. And I used the portrait for my covers for this series. In 1805, 26-year-old Zeb Pike was stationed on the Ohio River at Fort Massac. Fort Massac is on the northern side of the river in modern-day Illinois, and it's south of St. Louis. It was here where Zeb would once again meet up with his old friend and newly appointed governor of Upper Louisiana, General Wilkinson. The two had known each other since Zeb was only 16 years old. Young Pike had served with his father and Wilkinson in 1796 against Shawnee Indians. But their friendship really cemented when the two spent 52 hours together in a small canoe on the Mississippi River in 1802. Their journey had been fraught with the threat of Indians and the dangers of the rapids on the untamed Mississippi River. Wilkinson had just been given permission by Jefferson to send more exploring expeditions, and Wilkinson most likely visited the fort on his way to St. Louis to hand-pick Lieutenant Zebulon Montgomery Pike. By August of 1805, Pike and 20 soldiers had left the Ohio River to find and explore the headwaters of the Mississippi. Pike was also to establish the border between the United States and British Canada. While this mission was exciting and successful, I won't be going over it. Just know that he returned late, but he returned to St. Louis on April 30th of 1806 during the height of war fever. War between Spain and the U.S. By then, Wilkinson had another mission for the young lieutenant. This one would be much more daring and quite possibly illegal. While Pike was heading north, the invasion of Louisiana Territory by Spanish troops from Texas caused Jefferson to declare that U.S. sovereign territory had been violated. This gave Wilkinson some hope. Maybe now he could finally invade New Spain and form his empire with Burr, who was no longer Vice President of the United States. Wilkinson even wrote to a mutual friend of he and Burr's, and he remarked that Upper Louisiana was a healthy country, and, quote, "I shall be on the high road to Mexico," end quote. And he meant that literally. He was at that very moment planning an invasion. He was going to go across the plains, following the Arkansas River, hit the front range of the Rockies, go down to Santa Fe, and then take El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, all the way to Mexico City. You will soon hear some similarities between this plan and Zeb's Western adventure, as well as the invasion of Mexico in my forthcoming Mexican-American War series. But Wilkinson and Burr also drew up plans to sail hundreds of Marines from New Orleans to the port of Veracruz. They would then march to the halls of Montezuma. And again, as you'll hear in the Mexican War series, these two simultaneous invasions that Wilkinson and Burr created are exactly what President Polk and the Americans will use 40 years later. Amazingly, after writing to Jefferson's Secretary of War and telling him of these plans and that they should be acted upon immediately, Secretary of War Henry Dearborn approved them. Things between the nation and the Kingdom of Spain were heating up, and Spain didn't cool it down any when more Spanish soldiers invaded Louisiana for a second time in October of 1805. And even more soldiers would cross the Rio Grande and head into Kansas within a few months. By December, Jefferson was telling Congress to get ready for war and that Spain's aggression should, quote, "be met by force only," end quote. Surprisingly, the nation was behind Jefferson. One Ohio newspaper wrote, quote, "The cause of war is ample, the moment propitious," end quote. It was this atmosphere that Zeb, on April 30th of 1806, returned home to, and on the very day he returned, Wilkinson informed him of his next mission, which was to proceed ASAP as possible. Despite wanting to stay home after his journey and be with his new daughter and his wife, Zeb couldn't help himself and duty called. He wrote, quote, "The late dangers and hardships I had undergone together with the idea of again leaving my family made me hesitate. But the ambition of a soldier and the spirit of enterprise, which was inherent in my breast, induced me to agree to his proposition." End quote. And Pike was perfectly suited for this job. First of all, he was a classy and talented officer. He also had glowing reviews from his inspection by Jefferson's men. He also just accomplished a great deal during his Mississippi expedition. And lastly, the man spoke and wrote French, the language not only the Spanish elites could use, but also the language that the Pawnee, Osage, and Kiowa elites could speak and understand. Oh, and lest I forget, the man knew the territory of Louisiana, probably better than any other officer in the United States. In 1803, before he was stationed at Fort Massac, Zeb had been stationed at the westernmost American fort on the continent. This was Fort Kaskaskia, south of St. Louis and a few miles east of the Mississippi River. His main mission, while at the fort, was to debrief any French or Spanish or Indian traveler that passed through the gates. He would interrogate them on what the Spanish were doing, how the trades were going, and most importantly, he gathered an incredible amount of intelligence on the geography and lay of the land, from that point on the map to Santa Fe. Information few Americans, maybe only a handful of fur trappers who stuck to their wildernesses, knew. He would eventually write a memorandum for the House of Representatives, which the House would use in their decision on whether to explore or not. Zeb, at that time, had not gotten word that the U.S. now owned the land beyond the river, but still, his writings were quite important. He even had this to say of the journey from the Mississippi to Santa Fe, quote, "The journey can be made with ease in 15 or 20 days' march on foot, or in 10 or 12 on horseback. That 1/3 of the distance is through the woods, and the rest through an immense prairie, where not a tree, shrub, or knoll is seen to bound the prospect, and the horizon only terminates the traveler's view for many a successive day." End quote. He had never done that on foot, but he was about to. And he was wrong about how close Santa Fe was, but he had a bunch of other stuff correct. And it would soon be to his advantage, While Zeb was stationed at Kaskaskia, the Lewis and Clark expedition left St. Louis. Incredibly, Lewis wrote to Pike and asked him to come to the disembarking, but Pike was not at the fort for whatever reason, so he missed it. Lewis also stated that Pike should himself lead an adventure westward, to which Pike wrote back and said he would be honored to, and if maybe Lewis could pass on a good word. No record of any good word being passed has survived the passing of time, but I would not doubt if Pike's expeditions were because of everything previously mentioned and the fact that Lewis sent up a good word to his superiors. That word maybe even reached the president himself. As for Wilkinson, though, there was never a doubt in his mind that Pike was the man for the job. He was perfect for it. On May 3rd, Zeb wrote to his friend Captain Daniel Bissell and told him that he would be leaving within 3 weeks, and that he was going to take his newly adopted dog he'd been given by some Indians and most of the same men who'd just returned with him. He said of these men, quote, "Although they are a damned set of rascals, yet in the woods they are staunch fellows, and very proper for such expeditions as I am engaged in." End quote. Preparation began immediately. Flour, coffee, sugar, whiskey, Indian trade goods, telescope, sextant, tents, guns, and ammo were all amassed for the journey west. But one very important item he brought, which may or may not prove that Pike's mission was to spy, was a map. This map was the one Wilkinson had acquired during his spying years, and it was the same map that he had shown to Jefferson. The map contained everything between the Mississippi River and Santa Fe. So, Zeb didn't take the exact map, but he did copy most everything onto a map that he already had. Curiously and damningly, Pike added something to his own map that wasn't on the original. He drew a dotted line from the Platte River across the Arkansas River in Colorado under the Sangre de Cristos over to the Rio Grande and then down to Santa Fe. And between each major section, the number of days he expected to spend in those sections were also written down. This element is key, for when Pike does get captured by Spanish soldiers in the winter, he will adamantly claim that, "Oops, I just got lost, I swear it. I thought I was on the Red River. This isn't the Red River, this is the Rio Grande. Oh." This single piece of evidence proves, well, and a letter I'll discuss shortly, but this map proves that Zeb's goal was Santa Fe. It was certainly Wilkinson's goal, a goal that was okayed by the Secretary of War and most likely Thomas Jefferson himself. Although Jefferson will never admit it, and he too will forever keep up the ruse that Pike just got lost. But how did Zeb get such detailed routes to Santa Fe from St. Louis? Well, he gave us that answer on the bottom right-hand corner of the map. He wrote the names, pretty much all misspelled. He wrote the names of 3 people who lived in St. Louis at that time: Polite Cardinal, Jean-Marie Cardinal, and Jose Thibault. The Cardinal and Thibault families were some of the very first people to settle St. Louis in the 1760s. These families had been living in Prairie du Chien in Wisconsin as fur trappers, but in 1762, they shot and killed a British fur trapper and his son. They then fled down the river to St. Louis, where they helped establish the town before having children. These children being Hippolyte, not Polite, Jean-Marie, and Jose Jr. These families were pretty hardcore. They fought off, and sometimes died fighting, British, French, and Indian invaders to St. Louis. Some members of these families would eventually marry into the Pawnee Indian tribe, which in 1797 ended up traveling across the plains and over to the Spanish Peaks in Colorado, aka Two Chiefs Mountains, aka the breasts of the world. So the Pawnee and these 3 went to this beautiful area I love so much. They went there to sue for peace with the Comanche. They then headed to Santa Fe, where they probably did some fur trading. When they eventually returned to St. Louis, these 3 gave Pike the exact route they had taken, and Pike recorded it on his helpful little map. As Pike was preparing for his mission, though, Wilkinson got ominous orders from the Secretary of War, which told him to immediately leave for New Orleans, take command of all troops and militiamen, and push back the Spanish invaders. These guys were just traipsing around Louisiana, and it was not acceptable. Surprisingly, Wilkinson was super pissed at this new order. He thought the president was relieving him of duty of being governor of Upper Louisiana, and the traitor felt betrayed. But more telling than Wilkinson's reaction was the closeness which we came to war with Spain in 1806, something I had no previous knowledge of. Before Wilkinson left, he gave Pike very specific objectives for his mission. And I will quote George R. Matthews for what Wilkinson told Pike. Wilkinson assigned specific written objectives for Pike's new expedition. First, a group of approximately 50 Osage men, women, and children, recently freed from their Potawatomi captors by the American government, and a handful of Osage and Pawnee leaders returning from their visit to Washington, D.C., were to be escorted back to their respective homes on the Osage and Republican rivers. Next, Wilkinson assigned Pike 3 diplomatic tasks. 1. Arrange a peace between the warring Osage and Kansas people. 2. Retain the services of a Pawnee translator who spoke the Comanche language. And 3. Make contact with the formidable Comanche nation and persuade them to make peace with all other Native Americans living between themselves and St. Louis. In addition, and although he had no scientific training, Pike was told to take particular care to collect and preserve specimens of everything curious in the mineral or botanical worlds, which can be preserved and are portable. This scientific task was assigned, no doubt, to impress Wilkinson's naturalist boss, President Jefferson. And finally, Wilkinson instructed Pike to explore the headwaters of the Arkansas River, and, having accomplished this, to descend the Red River with a small contingent of Comanche headmen to the post of Natchitoches, and there receive further orders. An assignment to explore the Arkansas and Red Rivers to aid American territorial claims during the Louisiana boundary talks with Spain provided Pike geographical cover for being in disputed lands at a time when both nations believed that a war over Louisiana's boundaries could not be averted. End all quotes. But with these objectives, Wilkinson also gave Pike cover in the unfortunate event of him getting captured. Wilkinson wrote, quote, "You may find yourself approximate to the settlements of New Mexico. Therefore, it will be necessary you should move with great circumspection, and to prevent alarm or offense, because the affairs of Spain and the United States appear to be on the point of amiable adjustment. And, moreover, it is the desire of the President to cultivate the friendship and harmonious intercourse of all nations of the earth, and particularly our near neighbors, the Spaniards." End quote. In writing this, Wilkinson was giving cover for Pike. Certainly, if Pike was just doing the mission explicitly laid out, he would need no such covering statements. If the Spanish read this statement, they would only see the peaceful orders of the U.S. military's intention. This was just exploration, after all, which is exactly why Wilkinson wrote these words. And we know that's why he wrote them, because Wilkinson would tell a friend about Pike's ultimate goal, which was Santa Fe. And during this conversation, when his friend becomes shocked on account of the coming war and the danger Wilkinson had just put his men in, Wilkinson would respond to his friend, quote, "Mr. Pike and his party would have documents which would make them as safe in Santa Fe as at Philadelphia." End quote. As the time for Zeb's departure approached, with 3 days before leaving, he was given additional goals and personnel. Wilkinson informed him that he was now going to have a doctor on his expedition. He wrote, quote, "Dr. Robinson will accompany you as a volunteer. He will be furnished medicines, and for the accommodations which you give him, he is bound to attend your sick." End quote. This Dr. Robinson, John Hamilton Robinson, was a 24-year-old Virginian who had arrived to St. Louis the year before. Robinson is described in one article I read as an explorer, spy, diplomatic envoy, military adventurer, volunteer Mexican officer, and a mapmaker of imperialistic intent. He is credited with saying, quote, "Europe enslaved millions, America liberated them." End quote. Clearly he will be a very intriguing fellow as the story unfolds, although for now, He's merely just a physician. In terms of goals, Wilkinson also informed him that as part of his mission, he was to arrest any American citizen he came across that was engaged in the business of trading without a proper license. It sounds a little silly, but Wilkinson, as governor of Louisiana Territory, was the only one who could issue licenses, so he, A, wanted that revenue, and B, he had his own goals when it came to trade with New Mexico and New Spain, soon to be his very own empire, if he got his way. He did not want anyone cutting in on his territory, literally. Finally, the day of departure for our westward adventurers came on Tuesday, July 15, 1806. We know Zeb Pike was there and leading the expedition, but with him were the physician, Robinson, second in command, James Wilkinson, that is General Wilkinson's son, interpreter Antoine Baronet Vasquez, who spoke Osage and Pawnee, and then there are 19 other damned rascals, as Pike had put them, brave, adventurous army soldiers, many of which had been on Pike's Mississippi River journey. Pike wrote of his crew, quote, "Our party consisted of 2 lieutenants, 1 surgeon, 1 sergeant, 2 corporals, 16 privates, and 1 interpreter." End quote. They were heading up the Missouri River from a town named Bellefontaine, but what is now St. Ferdinand Township, about 14 miles north of St. Louis. They had 2 boats, a smaller and a larger one. Wilkinson piloted the smaller one, and Pike had the larger barge. The smaller boat, called a bateau, was a long flat-bottomed canoe with a mast and a sail and many an oar. The larger boat was also flat-bottomed, and it had a covered cabin. It did not have a sail, but it too had many an oar. Both boats had long ropes to tie up or pull the boat on the shore when the current got too strong. The many Indians, 51 according to Pike, all these 51 Indians that they were escorting back to their villages, they walked the south side of the river shore alongside the boats as the Americans fought against the current. On the 15th, the entire lot of them left at around 3 p.m. They would only make it 6 miles that day. It was a slow start to be sure, but the river's current was strong. Also, a rope snapped, the ships got turned around twice. It was slow going, even for these experienced rivermen. That night, the men would sleep on the south bank, but the Osage and Pawnees had walked a little bit ahead and camped elsewhere. The following morning, though, the 2 groups, the Americans and the Indians, ate breakfast together, but they separated afterwards. The Indians would make good time to a town called St. Charles, while Pike and his boats yet again struggled against the strong current. They'd only go 15 miles on July the 16th. Pike wrote that the day was filled with quote-unquote very severe labor. Thursday the 17th saw very little journeying, and the day was spent entirely in the town of St. Charles. And this was not the plan, but there was a bit of drama. First of all, in the morning, Pike was introduced to a 28-year-old New Jersey man named George Henry. Henry spoke some Spanish and fluent French. Henry, surprising Pike, volunteered to accompany them right there on the spot. Pike obliged the man and said, "Hop on board." Which was good because later that day, the sheriff would find Pike and arrest his original interpreter, Vasquez. But he won't be gone for long. Apparently, he had a large debt in St. Louis, a couple $100 worth, so he was sent back east to pay it. But at least Pike had a new interpreter for the time being. But there's more to this story of Vasquez being detained. The interpreter was purposefully arrested on behalf of the machinations of 2 traders back in St. Louis. The men were named Manuel Lisa and Jack Clamorgan. These men wanted to stall Pike's exploration to quote-unquote Santa Fe because they wanted their own expedition to Santa Fe to beat Pike. They wanted exclusive trade with the old town. They did not want Wilkinson to have said trade. But this means these men knew that Pike and his crew were heading to Santa Fe. And Pike even wrote that these men only had Vasquez detained so that they could beat Pike to New Mexico, which was not his stated goal. But we know now that it was indeed his destination. Zeb knew it. Wilkinson knew it. Probably Thomas Jefferson knew it. But again, we will never know if that's true. And the reason I'm mentioning this so often is because the Hart and Holbert Journal edition, it adamantly disputes that Zeb was a spy. I am making the case, with the help of George R. Matthews and others, that he indeed was a spy for Jefferson and Wilkinson, or definitely for Wilkinson. And I'll sum up what that means for the U.S. at the end, but it's important to mention. So every time there's evidence of espionage, I'm going to bring it up. I think it's pretty neat, too. Back to Lisa and Glamorgan, and Wilkinson sending traders to New Mexico. As Pike will find out soon enough, it was illegal for traders to enter New Mexico, period. You had to be a Spanish subject to enter the territory. So all of this was rather risky stuff to be doing, really. But money has a way of moving people. There was already a trading expedition that had been sent not long before Pike left. It was headed by a man named Baptiste Lalande, and it was sent by a man named William Morrison. William Morrison was the brother of James Morrison, which is the man Pike had been staying with here in the small town of St. Charles. Another reason we know that Pike was heading to Santa Fe was because Morrison handed Pike a debt collection bill, which was to be given to Lalande in Santa Fe. It seems everyone but 20th century historians knew that Pike was purposefully heading to Santa Fe. And the reason for this debt collection bill is because once Lalande made it to Santa Fe, he sold all of Morrison's goods and kept the proceeds. And that'll come up again later when Pike runs into the man in Santa Fe. One more thing to mention about Pike's mission in New Mexico. Wilkinson ordered Pike to allow his son, the second in command, to take a small detachment of soldiers once they reached the Arkansas. And Wilkinson Jr. was to head back to the United States. Wilkinson did not want his son to be encountering any Spanish soldiers. Pike, though, he could handle that. All right, so that was some of the drama. The arrest of Vasquez on account of all the behind-the-scenes intrigue. The other bit of drama was that someone told the Osage and Pawnee that enemy Indians were just up the river waiting for them. Pike didn't believe this, though, and he spent some time calming the fears of the people he was supposed to protect. Speaking of the Osage and Pawnees, the following day, the 18th, Pike and company broke camp, and Pike sent Wilkinson and the physician Dr. Robinson to escort the Indians overland to a place known as La Charrette. This town was the last town on the Missouri River, and they were to camp there and wait for Pike and the two boats. So off they went overland, while Pike had the new interpreter, George Henry, swear an oath of allegiance, and then he handed him the keys to the smaller boat that Wilkinson had been piloting. They only made it 10 miles on the river, although Pike wrote that they'd traveled 15. But after 10 miles, they made camp on the north bank where they got drenched to the bone by an all-nighter thunderstorm. Nobody slept, and 2 of the team members got sick. After the storm on the 19th, the river's current weakened considerably, which made traveling much easier for the 2 boats. So much easier that the 2 boats, well, the men on them, staged a few races. Pike's larger boat won. He then got one of his sick men to pilot that one. This guy had been walking on the shoreline while they rowed. That sick man piloted the barge, and Pike boarded the smaller boat. Pike then raced to the next campground, which he arrived at a half hour earlier than the barge. So Pike won both races that day. On the 20th, they left with the sunrise and meandered between high bluffs that lined both sides of the Missouri River. Hart and Holbert sum up the river at this area as, quote, "Along this stretch, the Missouri flows between high bluffs, separated far enough to admit large areas of alluvial floodplains, first on one side, then on the other, between the bluffs and the water. The river gradually swings back and forth between the bluffs, continually changing its course and the position and conformation of the islands." End quote. The 20th was an uneventful day, except that the other sick man, who was walking the shore, at some point either that day or before, maybe the next day, he deserted, never to return. A suspicion that Pike had written about on the 19th, and which was confirmed on about this day. The 21st forced a late start when yet another severe thunderstorm pushed back their departure until 4 p.m. But even with that late start, they arrived to the rendezvous point of La Charrette before the sun had finished setting. There, Pike met back up with Wilkinson, Robinson, the Indians, and much to Pike's surprise, Vasquez the interpreter. He had his debt paid by Wilkinson Sr., who then sent him right back out onto the expedition. That night, Pike, Wilkinson, Robinson, George Henry, and probably Vasquez, they slept at the house of a 64-year-old man named Joseph Chartrand. He was the founder of the town of La Charrette, although a very famous man by the name of Daniel Boone belonged to this small community, and he lived a few miles up the river. No comment on if they met the famous frontiersman. Pike and the entire entourage stayed in La Charrette for the entirety of the 22nd of July, mostly to allow their gear to dry after the 2 successive rainstorms. While there, Pike received a letter from Wilkinson, which pretty much urged him to speed it up and finish the mission before the end of the year. The army needed the intelligence he was to provide for the coming war with Spain, and of course, for Wilkinson's planned invasion of New Mexico. But while at the small town, Pike sent a letter to Wilkinson in response, and in this letter, he divulged quite a bit more than Wilkinson probably wanted him to. In the letter, Pike realizes that he's going to soon be in Comanche country, or as he calls them, the Titals. He then says, this is no doubt Spanish-claimed land. So, to get around this fact, if he is caught around the quote-unquote villages near Santa Fe, he will simply tell the Spanish that he was lost and he thought he was following a different river. This is the exact play he will use when the inevitable happens later. He then writes that once he's captured, he will simply ask the leader of Santa Fe to escort him back to the States, at which point Pike can assess the Spanish military's readiness and capabilities, aka collect intelligence. But he also tells Wilkinson that in the event they are captured and the Spanish look to do them harm, he will, quote, resist, even if the inequality was as great as at the affair of Bender or the Straits of Thermopylae, end quote. The Straits of Thermopylae is the famous Sparta versus Persia battle that the movie 300 made famous. But the affair of Bender, as far as I can tell, might relate to the Russians taking a fort in that town from the Turks in the late 18th century. Probably would have been fresh on military men's minds. But Pike is divulging in this letter that when he runs into the Spanish, he will simply claim ignorance and ask to be escorted to Louisiana. If the Spanish show signs of ill will, he will fight them to the last man. Hence, why Wilkinson did not want his son to be on that part of the journey. But again, Pike's given up the game here. His ultimate mission was to collect intelligence for the coming war with Spain. And not only did Zeb write this letter to Wilkinson, but he will keep a copy of this letter that he wrote on his persons for the duration of the mission. He is ultimately captured. His papers are all ultimately read. This letter and the map are the 2 damning pieces of evidence that prove to the Spanish Pike's real mission. And you'll hear all about that later. On the morning of the 23rd, before leaving La Charrette, Pike sent 2 letters, with one of them being the one to Wilkinson and the other describing the AWOL soldier Kennerman. And he says he should be found and tried for desertion. Wilkinson Jr. and Pike then piloted the boats and off they sailed for about 13 miles. Thursday, the 24th, saw them leave at 6:30 in the morning, despite some dense fog. Wilkinson was quote-unquote a little indisposed, so Vasquez piloted the smaller boat. They did an impressive 18 miles that day. They also shot 3 deer, 1 bear, and 3 turkeys. The next 3 days saw them make it around 33 miles upriver. Along the way, they killed a bear, 2 deer, 1 otter, 3 turkeys, and a raccoon. They ran into some Frenchmen who complained that the Osage River was so low that they could not ride in their canoes. This is a problem Zeb and his men will not have. They also raced a monstrous storm that was bubbling up on the horizon and barreling towards them, but they were spared any downpour. On Monday the 28th, they finally reached the Osage River. The Indians got so excited at realizing they were almost home that they began to celebrate, which in turn got Pike's men excited, so they fired their guns up into the air, as one does, like I did on my wedding day. They then followed the Osage River upstream so that they could safely return their Osage wards. The Missouri River, at this point, it takes a drastic northwest turn before going in a steady direction to the northwest. The Osage River, on the other hand, heads pretty much straight west until it reaches Kansas, where its headwaters are. So the men are going to be crossing western Missouri until they reach the Osage River's headwaters in eastern Kansas. By now, the Indians were giving Pike and his men some headaches, for they were constantly squabbling and meandering around. The crossing the Osage from one side of the river to the other became quite the task in and of itself. But eventually, Pike gave the Indians some whiskey, which quote-unquote intoxicated all of them. That's one way to solve a problem. The 29th saw yet another deluge of rain, which one of his men got lost in while he was rounding up Indians. He returned after dark, soaked to the bone. The boats came to their first rapids on the 30th, but more followed on the 31st of July. Also on the 31st, the saddest event of the mission so far occurred that morning. Every morning, the unnamed dog that Zeb had adopted on his previous mission, he would always run out and hunt. But on this day, he did not return. Zeb wrote, quote, "I this day lost my dog." End quote. Not only was he saddened by the loss of his friend, but now they had no retriever to grab game out of the water. The first pre-dawn morning and day of August saw enough rain to raise the Osage River 6 inches. They stayed in camp all day and killed 6 deer. Meanwhile, the river would continue to rise over the next few days as well. At one point, while Pike had been out hunting, the water had risen to his tent, but he was able to move it just in time. It's amazing to think about what pre-dammed rivers were like. They were completely wild and unpredictable. At one point on the 4th of August, it will rise a foot in 1 hour. They rode 20 miles on the 2nd and the 3rd of August. They also killed quite a bit of animals: goose, turkey, deer, a wildcat. On the 4th, having had enough of the mast, which was rarely with the wind, and now getting entangled in all the branches overhead on account of the swollen river, so the men took down the mast, carved their names in it, and set it adrift. Pike remarks that it was made in northern Mississippi, which it will soon be floating past if unimpeded. On the 5th of August, they stayed on shore and hunted, but Dr. Robinson and Pike had an exciting encounter in the woods. Here's Pike's telling of the dangerous encounter. Today in our tour, I passed over a remarkably large rattlesnake as he lay curled up, and trod so near him as to touch him with my foot, he drawing himself up to make room for my heel. Dr. Robinson, who followed me, was on the point of treading on him, but by a spring avoided it. I then turned round and touched him with my ramrod, but he showed no disposition to bite, and appeared quite peaceable. The gratitude which I felt towards him for not having bit me induced me to save his life. End quote. Back when my wife and I were dating, she flew from LA to Albuquerque and I drove from Wisconsin to the airport in Albuquerque before driving us up to Santa Fe. At one point on the trip, I took her to Bandelier to see the ruins. On our walk back to the truck in the canyon, I came an inch from stepping on a big, fat rattlesnake myself. I leapt over it at the last second and yelled for my wife to stop. My heart about leapt out of my chest. I took a video of it crossing the sidewalk, paying no never mind to us, but the video was quite shaky as I myself was shaking. I like rattlesnakes. I'm no Everett Ruse who kills them willy-nilly, but I will kill one if it's in my yard. It hasn't happened yet. I can't chance it with my little son and my dog. On the 6th, the Indians left the group, accompanied by Dr. Robinson, George Henry, and Sergeant Bollinger. They could walk in 15 miles what the boats were about to do in 35. This was the Osage's land, so they knew the route. Since there were no Indians impeding them, the 2 boats on the 7th made 21 miles, and as they rode, they passed, quote, many beautiful cliffs on both sides of the river, saw a bear and wolf swimming the river. End quote. That just sounds picturesque. At this point in the journey, they had thus far killed 44 deer, 10 turkeys, 2 bears, 2 raccoons, 1 wildcat, 1 otter, and 1 goose. But on the 7th, 1 bear and 1 wolf swimming in the river were spared. I don't know why. That caught me off guard there for a little bit. By the 9th, the river had dropped more than 6 feet, which is just incredible. They passed rapids, more beautiful cliffs, and then they met up with the Indians again after going 25 miles. They then made it 18.5 miles before Pike offered a day of rest and a day of drying, since the rain had returned. They also had to patch up the bottom of the smaller boat since it had hit bottom and breached. On the 11th, as they continued to dry their belongings, the men organized a shooting competition. There's no mention of how it went down, but Zeb does say he won. His prize was a nice jacket and a twist of tobacco. A twist of tobacco is essentially a braided rope of cured tobacco. It was a lot of tobacco, too. One could smoke it in their pipe, roll it, chew it, or use it as currency. When Pike won, though, he gave all this to his quote-unquote young fellow who waited on me. George R. Matthews informed me in his book that at this time in the military, all officers essentially had an enlisted servant. Pike's enlisted man's name is Doherty. After the contest, Pike and another private went out hunting, but they failed to bring enough water. This is August in Missouri. The humidity and the heat were very strong that day. Pike records in the journal that later that day at sundown, it was still 88 degrees Fahrenheit. So after hunting, Pike was almost unable to return to camp. He was struggling from heat exhaustion so badly. When he reached the river, though, on the other side of camp, he got on all fours and drank liberally from the Osage. He then gathered his wits and swam across the river to camp, which helped further cool him down, but the damage was done. It would take a couple days for him to recuperate. On the 12th, after they'd gone 24 miles, a thunderstorm rolled in and blew a bunch of Zeb's clothing into the river, which quote-unquote sank immediately. Still suffering, Pike was too weak to leave the boat and climb ashore, so he slept in the small cabin on the boat without supper while it rained all night. One very interesting event occurred on the 12th. Essentially, Pike discovered one of the Indians had stolen a tin cup from the men and had attached it to his person on his belt. This cup had the initials of the soldier whom had it stolen from. Pike confronted the Indian, but he refused to give it back. So he had to go to the chief or the leader of these Osage, and when Pike threatened to execute the thief, the chief made the Indian give back the cup. What I found interesting in all of this is what Pike wrote about the Indians and how to interact with them. He wrote, quote, "I certainly should have put my threats into execution from this principle, formed from my experience during my intercourse with Indians, that if you have justice on your side and do not enforce it, they universally despise you." End quote. And this is very wise words from the lieutenant here. Wise words. A lot of us would do well to remember. Besides seeing trout for the first time around these dates, on the 13th, after a bunch more rain, they began to see prairie hills for the first time as well. They were leaving the woods of the Ozarks and entering the land of the Great Plains. On the 14th of August, Pike, having now fully recovered, ran into 3 French traders led by a man named Baptiste La Tulipe. La Tulipe then informed Pike that a band of Osage warriors were gearing up to go west to fight some Kansas people. But even more troubling, another Osage war party was on the move south to the Arkansas River to attack and kill white settlers there. This was bad news for a number of reasons. But if you'll recall, one of his missions was to gain peace with the Plains tribes, specifically Osage and Kansas. Clearly, this news put that goal in jeopardy. It's hard to make peace when one side's hell-bent on making war. Pike quickly wrote a letter to Wilkinson informing him of this and handed the note to La Tulipe along with some whiskey, which the 3 Frenchmen took on their journey. Hopefully the letter would reach the Americans in time. It would not. The following day, the 15th, the Osage members from their camp upriver, the ones not with Pike in the entourage, they must have got word that their brethren were nearby, for they met the Indians along the route, and Lieutenant Wilkinson would later tell Pike about the meeting. And this is what Pike writes of their reunion. Quote, Lieutenant Wilkinson informed that their meeting was very tender and affectionate. Quote, wives throwing themselves into the arms of their husbands, parents embracing their children, and children their parents, brothers and sisters meeting, one from captivity, the other from the towns. They, at the same time, returning thanks to the good God for having brought them once more together. End quote. Now this is back to Pike's own words. In short, the root ensemble was such as to make polished society blush when compared with those savages, in whom the passions of the mind, either joy, grief, fear, anger, or revenge, have their full scope. Why can we not correct the baneful passions without weakening the good? End all quotes. He's essentially saying, why can't the Indians keep these good qualities and abandon the troubling ones? The Osage leader eventually gave a speech in which he reminds the Osage that it wasn't the Spanish or the French that freed their brethren. No, it was the Americans. He ends his speech with, quote, what can you do in return for all this goodness? Nothing. All your lives would not suffice to repay their goodness. End quote. Pike then remarks that this Osage leader, No Ears, had his own children also in captivity, but not a single one of them were able to be returned to him. The Potawatomi still had them. So who are these Osage? Well, I briefly mentioned it earlier, but essentially they have been captured by the Potawatomi Indians and kept as slaves. Then the American forces fought the Potawatomi and freed these Osage. Pike was to return them to their own people, thereby securing peace on the plains, at least with the Osage, who were apparently at this moment heading south to kill white men on the Arkansas River, at least one particular headman who I will talk about shortly. Over the next 3 days, as they approached the Grand Osage village, Pike and his boats went 37 miles, and then 41 and a half before slowing their pace to 19 1/4 miles. They were making great time on the water as Wilkinson and the Indians were on foot. On the 18th, Pike sent Vasquez, the interpreter, on foot to the village to see if he could borrow some horses. Also on that day, Wilkinson returned after having dropped the Indians off at the Grand Village. Curiously, Wilkinson had obtained a letter which had beaten Pike and his men to the village. It was from Lieutenant Wilkinson's father, the general. The letter is further proof of Wilkinson's grand plan of spying on the Spanish at St. Afe. That's how they spell, the Americans spell Santa Fe, St.Afee. The letter was basically another cover for if Pike gets caught. Wilkinson then, in a different correspondence, complains about the two who had the interpreter arrested, Lisa and Clamorgan. He says that if their trading venture goes through in Santa Fe, remember, something that he himself was planning, if their venture goes through, it would be bad for relations between America and Spain, and he was going to try to put a stop to it. The letter describes to Pike thus: the Spanish, that these two were going to set up small trading forts near Santa Fe to stash their goods in to sell to the Spaniards and Puebloans. One of those would be at the base of the Spanish Peaks in today's Colorado. Pike was instructed by Wilkinson that if he came across any of Lisa's agents of trade or his operation, he was to quote-unquote blow it up. For America. And most importantly, for Wilkinson. There's more to the letter, like how Wilkinson said some people are creating rumors that he was a spy for Spain 20 years ago, which he told Pike to dismiss. So hints of the Burr conspiracy were beginning to be whispered. And Wilkinson is still a spy for Spain. He ends his letter with a cryptic message that only he and Pike would have understood. Here is George R. Matthews' take on what this statement is and represents. Wilkinson concluded by writing, "You may open your correspondence with the Secretary of War, Henry Dearborn, but I would caution you against anticipating a step before you, for fear of deception or disappointment." Only Wilkinson and Pike understood this cryptic statement, but we can guess. Likely, while Wilkinson clearly gave Pike permission to communicate with Dearborn, He seemed to also suggest that Pike not divulge to the Secretary his proposed strategy of pretending to be lost in the Rocky Mountains when confronted by Spanish troops, in hope of receiving an escorted tour of New Mexico. Wilkinson continued, "To me you may and must write fully and freely, not only giving a minute detail of everything past worthy of note, but also of your prospects in the conduct of the Indians." In a previous letter, he had implied that Pike could probably guess when he should arrive in Natchitoches on the Red River. Now, Wilkinson more directly advised Pike, "It is interesting to you to reach Natchitoches in season before winter 1806 to 1807, to be at the seat of government pending the session of Congress. Yet you must not sacrifice any essential object to this point." He concluded, "Should fortune favor you on your present excursion, your importance to our country will, I think, make your future life comfortable." While at first read that last sentence sounds sinister, Wilkinson probably meant only that Pike could expect Congress to follow standard practice and bestow honors, promotion, and pecuniary rewards upon the leader of a successful exploratory expedition. There is no reason to suspect that Wilkinson was linking Pike's reconnaissance mission to the Burr conspiracy. End all quotes. It is here I will mention Archer Butler Holbert's scorching remarks in his opening chapter of the Southwestern Journals of Zebulon Pike. He spends the entire scathing chapter debunking the myth that Pike was a spy. He rails against authors who, in the early part of the 20th century, were marked upon and defended the accusation that Pike was a spy. He writes at one point that Pike was, quote, "more practical than his biographers," end quote. He writes in the same long paragraph, quote unquote, "the blatherdash of his critics." The man is not kind to previous historians who had this quote unquote theory in mind. And I'll quote him one more time before saying he's wrong. Here's the quote. "Critics who have attempted to entangle Pike and Wilkinson's intrigues with Aaron Burr and Spanish officials have stated that secret instructions now issued to Pike called for the spying out of routes to and conditions in New Mexico, under the guise of his also being ordered to explore the upper Arkansas River and the portages between it and the Red River. They point out that the plan was General Wilkinson's and not that of President Jefferson's, as in the case of Lewis and Clark, now on their way home from the Pacific, or the Freeman-Dunbar survey of the lower Red River. The point is not honestly made." End quote. Now, I disagree. George R. Matthews and many other biographers also disagree. It seemed Holbert was attempting to rewrite history in a more favorable light for Pike. But Pike's name has remained unsullied, if it has been remembered at all in the 21st century. He wasn't tied in to the Burr plot at all. If Pike's nation was about to go to war with Spain, why not try and ascertain your enemy's strength? But the story I'm going to tell y'all will further prove out that Pike knew what he was doing and who he was doing it for. And he was doing it for his nation, because he was ever the patriot and never a traitor. Back to the story. The general's son, Lieutenant Wilkinson, described to Pike his reception the previous day at the Grand Osage village. He wrote about how the chief, Wind, or Tutasugee, rode up to Wilkinson with 180 well-dressed and painted men on horseback. They formed a column for he and the chief to walk through, and then they did some fancy riding. As he and the chief entered the encampment, they fired 4 shots from cannons the Indians had stolen from an older Spanish fort. He then states that there were about 1,000 Osage Indians in attendance, and that he was taken into the lodge of Soldier of the Oak, where he was complimented and then fed corn, buffalo meat, and some small watermelons that were apparently highly flavored. On the 19th, while Pike and his boats were on shore and with Wilkinson in attendance, a chief of the Grand Osage village, Chief Pawhuska, with about 40 or 50 of his men, arrived to camp with horses for Zeb and the fellows. They would then use these horses to take all of their supplies from the Osage River to the Little Osage River. He would camp here at this spot, and he would make this spot a place Pike named Camp Independence. This would be his base camp for the next 12 days. During the moving of the camps, though, Chief Pawhuska told Pike that currently, right now, at the Grand Osage Village, there were 3 men from St. Louis. 3 men who'd been sent by Manuel Lisa. If you'll recall, Wilkinson had just informed Pike to capture and blow up their venture. So Pike sent Vasquez and Wilkinson to the village to bring Pike the leader of these 3 men. Before long, the 2 returned with Baptiste Duchaquet. When asked if he had the proper license for trading, Baptiste admitted that no, he did not. And with that, Pike arrested him and kept him at Camp Independence. The following day, on the 20th, Pike interrogated Baptiste, who said he had left on the 1st of August in a canoe, which is after Pike left, and so they somehow slipped by the expedition. Maybe they just rode through the many rainstorms that stalled the lieutenant. No matter. Pike ordered this man and his 2 accomplices to head back to St. Louis at once and to seek no more trading expeditions into the Great Plains. Baptiste, surrounded by soldiers, agreed. He got his men, packed his things, and off they went back to St. Louis. So, mission accomplished on that front for Pike. At this time, in 1806, and this is coming from author R.I. Holcomb, in 1806, there were about 4,000 Osages that belonged to 3 different groups: the Grand Osages, the Little Osages, and the Arkansas Band. Their chiefs were Whitehair, or Chevaux Blanche, or also Pawhuska. Then there is the Wind, or Tuckasegee, and in the Arkansas Band, it's Big Trek. The Osage people at this time, at least the men, they were divided into 2 groups: warriors and hunters, and cooks and doctors. The doctors were essentially medicine men with knowledge of the supernatural. According to Holcomb, the Osages were, quote, said to be the finest specimens of Western Indians. They were tall, erected, and dignified, and they were very agile and muscular, end quote. Apparently, the Osage were over 6 feet tall on average. I remember Pike is 5'8". Whitehair, the Pawhuska or Whitehair, was a whopping 7 feet tall. John Bradbury in 1819 wrote of the Osage and said, quote, "The Osages are so tall and robust as almost to warrant the application of the term gigantic. Few of them appear to be under 6 feet, and many are above it. Their shoulders and visages are broad, which tend to strengthen the idea of their being giants." End quote. Artist George Catlin called the Osage the, quote, tallest race of men in North America, either red or white skinned, there being few indeed of the men at their full growth who are less than 6 feet in stature, and very many 6.5, and others 7 feet. End quote. Even Thomas Jefferson remarked after meeting with the Osage in Washington that they were, quote, certainly the most gigantic men we have ever seen. End quote. The Osage originated in the Ohio River Valley to the east. They were probably descendants of the Mississippian peoples who ruled Cahokia, so they would have historically had ties to the Toltecs. But after constant and continual warring with the Iroquois, they headed west and arrived in Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma by the 17th century. The Indians to their south and west feared the Osage. The Indians to their north and east hated them and fought them as often as they could, which is why the Potawatomi had in captivity so many of their number. The problem at this time for the Osage is that, as Holcomb puts it, quote, the humane policy of the United States in procuring treaties of amity between them and other tribes, and in calculating upon them the divine precepts of the Golden Rule, practically made Quakers of them. End quote. The Osage, despite once being fine warriors and being enormous men, they were not fighting back. So these were the people that Zeb and his men found themselves surrounded by for the next 12 long and troublesome days. On the 20th, Pike met the Wind and Pawhuska and quite a few of their men. At that time, he gave Pawhuska's son, No Ears, a Jefferson Peace Medal before advising both chiefs that he would be speaking to everyone in a few days. He had some words from their new white father in St. Louis, General Wilkinson. He also most likely gave peace medals to the two chiefs as well. I didn't know about these medals, but George R. Matthews gave quite a bit of insight into them. He writes of them, quote, flags, military dress uniforms, engraved silver pipes, silver-headed canes, and silver peace medals were all used as tools of diplomacy with the Indian nations, but peace medals, indisputably, were the most esteemed. The Jefferson Peace Medal was minted in Philadelphia in 5 different sizes, the largest being 4.13 inches in diameter, while the smallest was less than 1.77 inches in diameter. A silver band held the two sides of the Jefferson medals together. A stamped likeness of Jefferson with the words T.H. Jefferson, President of the U.S., A.D. 1801, adorned the obverse side of the medal, while the reverse side pictured a peace pipe and tomahawk crossed at the handles and 2 clasped hands with the words peace and friendship. End quote. Finally, on the 22nd, Pike addressed the leaders in both his own words and in Wilkinson's. Unfortunately, Wilkinson's words have been lost to history, but we can infer that it had something to do with what I mentioned a couple minutes ago. The Osage. They needed to start fighting back. Here is what Pike told the assembled Osage leaders. Quote, my brothers, you see by the word of your father which I have just given you that he does not wish you to remain tranquil when your enemies come to kill you, but that you prepare to destroy those who would harm you. My brothers, for this reason I believe that you should send some spies or scouts to the Missouri, and if you find that your enemies are approaching, be brave, prepare an ambush, and destroy them. My brothers, this is only to defend yourselves, not to go to the villages of your enemies and kill their women and children, who are innocent. My brothers, you see from this last message, and also by the release of your women and children from captivity, how sincere is the friendship of your American father. End quote. An American father would be Jefferson. These were wise words to a fearsome-looking people, but it had 2 meanings. 1, the U.S. Army can't bail out the Osage and other tribes every time there's a squabble, but also, the Osage could be a very valuable ally against Spain and her aligned Indians. Pike then asked the chiefs if they could please make peace with the Kansas people, and that he has been instructed to take some of these Osage men up to the Pawnee Republic to do just that. Oh, and we're also going to make peace with any Comanche we come across. Pike then asked for some warriors because he needed to go see that last chief I talked about when describing the Osage, Great Track. Great Track had just attacked a boat on the Arkansas River, which saw 2 white men killed, 2 more injured, and unfortunately, Pawhuska's brother-in-law, an Indian, who happened to be on board, was also killed. Pike asked the Osages for, quote, 2 or 3 of your warriors to descend the Arkansas River with a party of my warriors to the village of Great Track, for whom I have a message from your father in St. Louis. End quote. He then read them the message which states, quote, my brothers, Great Track and his people are not Osages. If they were, why do they make war against the children of your great father? My brothers, if the word of your great father in St. Louis, which has been sent to me for the Great Track, does not open his eyes, your great father will abandon him and will no longer consider him and his nation to be his children, but will permit his white and red warriors to raise the tomahawk against him. End quote. So Pike was asking a lot of these Osages, but then again, he had just brought back 50 of their once captive brothers and sisters. His last 2 requests were for some horses to help get around while in and around the camp, and once Lieutenant Wilkinson had reached the headwaters of the Arkansas, if some of his warriors could safely guide him back to St. Louis. He then concluded his speech to the Osage with, quote, my brothers, I address myself to both villages, as if they were one. For it is the wish of your great father that they should be as one nation. Take counsel together and be strong. I have spoken. End quote. But then he thought of something else, and he said, quote, my brothers, we are going on a long voyage. When we are with the Osage, we consider ourselves at home. I have brought no gifts for you, but as a mark of our esteem, I give you almost the last drop of our whiskey, a little tobacco, and some things to keep in remembrance of this day. End quote. The reaction from the chiefs for all of these requests was less than enthusiastic, and they all told Pike, let us talk it over and we'll have an answer tomorrow for you. To which Pike thanked them and gave them the whiskey and tobacco. Pike felt good about the meeting, though. This was only the third of 12 days that he and his men would frustratingly spend in camp, so his mind will change. On the 23rd, the chiefs delayed their response. On the 24th, the chiefs informed him that they had no extra horses. The 25th, he was informed by the chiefs that, okay, a few horses have been found and a few men will accompany you. On the 26th, he was given one horse. He then sold the small boat for $100 in goods, and then alarmingly, he was told Potawatomis were on their way. Pike was becoming increasingly frustrated with the Osage. He was still sitting around on the 27th, 28th, 29th, the 30th, and 31st, as the clock up on the wall was ticking. On the 28th, he wrote Wilkinson and said, quote, "You will no doubt be much surprised to perceive by the date of this letter that we are still here." End quote. He also told Wilkinson that out of the many hundreds of horses, the chiefs only secured them 10. But in reality, they would in the end only provide 4. To be fair, the chiefs, especially Tutasugee, did seem quite distressed and disappointed in their people for not being willing to help out more. But in reality, the Osage had been allies to Spain since 1763, when St. Louis was founded. They no doubt knew the drums of war between the two nations were beating, and the people, in case of a Spanish win, did not want to be punished. Pike would write to Wilkinson again and say, quote, "It is with extreme pain I keep myself cool amongst the difficulties which those people appear to have a disposition to throw in my way, but I have declared to them that I should go on." End quote. Since they lacked enough horses when they finally left on September 1st, George Henry, the young volunteer, was forced to head back to St. Louis. Although it would not be the last time Pike would ever see him. They would, in fact, serve together in the War of 1812. Henry would be a second lieutenant in Pike's 15th Infantry, although he would resign 6 weeks before the Battle of York, aka Toronto, a battle which will see the then Brigadier General Zebulon Montgomery Pike successfully take the fort. I will talk about that fateful battle at the very end of this series over our hero and spy. At both the Grand and Little Osage villages, Pike and his men, minus George Henry, added 3 Pawnees and 4 chiefs of the Grand Osages and 7 warriors of No Ears and No Ears himself. Pike's entire party now had 38 members of both red and white men, and even women. Their next destination was the Grand Pawnee Village on the Republican River in far southern Nebraska. Well, that was almost his next destination. As they were marching away on the 2nd of September, they got word that the American Indian agent to the Osage, a man named Pierre Choteau, had arrived back at the Osage village. This man was important, for he had a monopoly on trade in the southern part of the Louisiana Territory. He had also been providing guns and ammo to Big Track and his rebel band of Osage Indians. A rebel band that was growing by the day as disaffected young Osage men from the Little and Grand villages were joining him on the Arkansas River. The Osage never did go down with Pike to talk to him, so Pike went back to the villages to see what he could ascertain from Choteau. And Choteau apparently gave Pike all the news, including that Wilkinson had finally went south after 3 months of stalling to take command of the soldiers in New Orleans and repel the Spanish. But Pike was thoroughly unimpressed with the Indian agent. He would write Wilkinson of this, and Wilkinson would write, quote, "Mr. Pike considers our agent an impostor in all things, and at heart our enemy." End quote. Pike would again leave the following morning on the 3rd. He'd catch up to his people, and they would all continue on their journey, at least for 1 day. Because 2 days after his rendezvous, 7 Osage warriors and No Ears would just up and abandon the journey and head back to the villages. It's amazing that Pike did not lose his cool. But they were now out on the prairies, which Pike seemed to enjoy, and which helped ease his frustration at the Osages. He wrote about them and said, quote, the prairies, he said that they were, quote unquote, prairies boundless in view, and, quote, prairies which the eye assisted by the best glass could not compass, end quote. His most praiseworthy remark said, quote, the prairie rising and falling in regular swells as far as the sight can extend produces a beautiful appearance, end quote. But that praise was short-lived, for soon they were walking through the rough and rugged Flint Hills, which blistered his feet and made them very sore, he wrote. He did like the wildlife, though. He mentioned that when they ascended a particular hill, and from that spot on top, and all at the same moment, he saw buffalo, pronghorns, elks, deer, and even panthers. A regular American Garden of Eden. Now, I very briefly lived in the Flint Hills in Manhattan, and he described more beauty than I saw. Granted, I didn't get out into the wilderness very much. Maybe then I'd have a different opinion. I think the only time I ever went outside was to hunt coyotes with night vision gear in the middle of the night, so I couldn't even see the land, even if I'd wanted to. Well, I guess I saw the land, it was just all green. While out in the Flint Hills, one of the Osage remarked that they were on Kansas hunting grounds. Therefore, he and all the men should kill as many buffalo as they could to deprive their enemies of food. They killed 6 buffalo on September 12th. But eventually, by Sunday, September 14th, this killing would bother Pike, and he would demand that the men, including the Osage, cease their shooting of the buffalo. He wrote in the journal, quote, I prevented the men shooting at the game, not merely because of the scarcity of ammunition, but, as I conceived, the laws of morality forbid it also. End quote. It's a wise man. I mean, he didn't mean, though, that they were no longer going to kill buffalo, but rather they were only going to kill the buffalo they planned on eating. Also on the 14th, as they were drawing nearer to the Pawnee camp, Pike sent Robinson the doctor and a young Osage named Frank on ahead to make contact with the Pawnees. On the 17th of September, they were still marching, and Pike remarked that not only was game getting more scarce, but their provisions were dwindling as well. 2 days later, on the 19th, with a steady light rain that persisted for 2 days, Pike bedded down and decided to take a break. He mentions that they read the Bible, and also, surprisingly, they gave themselves little tattoos on their arms, which will, quote, frequently bring to mind our forlorn and dreary situation, as well as the happiest days of our life, end quote. I'm not sure what kind of tattoos they were or how they did it, or if they were permanent or just temporary. On the 20th, with rain still falling, they spied a few buffalo, which they brought back and ate. Pike and the crew, by now, were beginning to worry about Frank, the young Pawnee, and the doctor's absence. And they were about to need the doctor. The following day was a rough one for our explorers. They still had not seen or heard from the doctor or the Osage. Lieutenant Wilkinson came down with a fever and a severe headache. Another of Pike's men had been sick for a few days now. And most troubling, one of the Osage women that had accompanied them came to Pike and told him that her husband and another Osage man were going to flee that night and take the horses and guns with them. He writes in the journal, because of this, quote unquote, we engaged her as our spy. He then writes a few harsh lines about the Indians that had troubled him so much thus far. He wrote, quote, thus were we obliged to keep ourselves on our guard against our own companions and fellow travelers, men of a nation highly favored by the United States, but whom I believe to be a faithless set of poltroons, incapable of a great and generous action. Among them, indeed, there may be some exceptions. End quote. And a poltroon means a contemptible coward. When night fell, Pike called one of the Osage men over and pretty much said, I know you're going to desert, which is fine, but you have to leave your horse and gun here with me. Besides, quote, I only wanted men with us, end quote. Obviously, this hurt the Osage, who replied, I am a man, and I always keep my promises. The Osage then brought Pike all of his belongings and slept by Pike at the fire that night. You know, it is interesting. I love George R. Matthews' writings, and I really enjoyed our conversation, but I do find it funny that in his book, he ignores all negative interactions between Pike and the Indians. The other books I read did not, especially Pike's own journal. The following day, the 22nd, Wilson's sickness prevented too much travel, but at least they ran into a Pawnee hunter, and he gave them good news. The hunter told Pike that his chief had left camp with around 60 horses the day after Robinson, the doctor, had arrived. But he and his men had gone too far north, and they'd missed each other. Pike hadn't been making good time on account of the rain and Wilkinson's condition. The hunter also distressingly told Pike that the Comanche were on the warpath. When were they not? And they had recently killed 6 Pawnees. Then the Kansas stole some Pawnee horses. And oddly enough, this hunter informed Pike that over 300 Spanish soldiers had again crossed into Louisiana. That last part was certainly pertinent news to Pike. It would be another 2 days before Pike and the gang finally ran into the Pawnees who were out searching for him. Frank, the Osage, who had gone with the doctor, was among the 4 men who initially found them, but soon several more Pawnees would show up, and one of them was given an incredibly interesting description by Pike. He wrote, quote, "One of them wore a scarlet coat with a small medal of General Washington and a Spanish medal also." End quote. Now, I wonder what his story was. Even more Pawnees would show up, and they'd have buffalo meat. They would also have mules, horses, blankets, and bridles. And they'd gotten all of that from the Spanish, because the Spanish had shown up to their village just a few weeks prior. Further news that must have sent a shiver down Pike's spine. But then, the following day, they crossed over a, quote, "very large road on which the Spanish troops returned, and on which we could yet discover the grass beaten down in the direction which they went." End quote. The 2 parties had only just missed each other. Maybe tarrying in the Osage village had been a blessing in disguise. On the 25th, they finally reached the Pawnee encampment, but they were asked to please wait while they prepared to receive these Osage. Eventually, the Pawnee would arrive, and I'll let Pike describe their arrival. "We were a small distance in advance of the Indians. The Pawnees then advanced to within a mile of us and halted, divided into 2 troops, and came on each flank at full charge, making all the gestures and performing the maneuvers of a real war charge. Then they encircled us around, and the chief advanced in the center and gave us his hand. His name was Cheratarish. He was accompanied by his 2 sons and a chief by the name of Ixatapi." End quote. George R. Matthews paints a really nice picture of these Pawnee when he wrote, quote, "Suddenly from their front appeared 400 mounted warriors wearing little but breechclouts and moccasins, all facial hair, including eyebrows, plucked, and a little hair on their heads standing up, stiff with fat and red paint, in a narrow ridge down the center of an otherwise bald skull." End quote. That must have been a sight for Pike. After Cheratarish, or White Wolf, after he had taken the hands of Pike, the one Osage chief with them lit a pipe and handed it to White Wolf, who took a whiff or 2 from it, and then he invited them all to the Pawnee camp. Pike records in the journal that as they were escorted, the Pawnees were running races on both sides of the procession. Eventually, they reached the outskirts of the village where the Osage and Pawnees exchanged gifts. Pike then sent his men a little up river to make camp, while he went into the village and dined at White Wolf's lodge. On the 26th, Pike moved his men's encampment a little closer to the village. He wrote this of the new spot: "We pitched our camp upon a beautiful eminence, from whence we had a view of the town, and all that was transacting." End quote. It sounds like a really cool village as well, at least the way George R. Matthews sums it up. He wrote, "The village, comprised of closely spaced large earth lodges, lay on the south side of the Republican River. The round, domed mounds, post and beam structures with floors sunk several inches below the ground surface, had roofs supported by slanted poles, covered with layers of grass, brush, and sod. The entrance, a short above-ground tunnel of the same construction, faced to the east or southeast, and a hole in the center of the roof let in light and released smoke from the fire pit directly below. So sturdy were these man-made hills that children played up and down on them, and adults found them a pleasant place to sit, see the view, and catch the breeze. From his hilltop camp above the river, Pike looked out over a large village of probably over 200 lodges, where lived more than 1,000 Pawnee men, women, and children. End quote. So it was a nice semi-permanent village. They weren't like their neighbors the Comanche. This description reminds me more of the Mississippians. But this area was, until they were moved to Oklahoma, the Pawnee's ancestral lands. They'd been in the Great Plains for nearly 2,000 years when Pike visited. But they had lost a lot of their land to other Indians by this point. They used to spread from the Missouri River all the way to the Front Range of Colorado. So the Comanche had taken some of their land, but the Apache had before that. Then the Osage moved in. The Sioux had also recently taken their lands to the northwest. But the Pawnee were still a strong nation when Pike arrived in 1806. Shortly after Pike moved his camp, some Kansas chief and 11 of his warriors had arrived at the village. So now there were Osage, Kansas, and Pawnee chiefs all situated together. It was a perfect time for Pike to draft a treaty and fulfill more of his mission. So on Sunday, September 28th, he had the chiefs in attendance listen to his treaty proposal. Pike wrote of the terms, quote, "After having smoked the pipe of peace and buried past animosities, they, the Kansas and Osage, individually and jointly bound themselves in behalf of and for their respective nations, to observe a friendly intercourse and keep a permanent peace, and mutually pledge themselves to use their every influence to further the commands and wishes of their great father. We, therefore, American chiefs, do require of each nation a strict observance of the above treaty, as they value the goodwill of their great father, the President of the United States. Done at our council fire at the Pawnee Republican Village, the 28th of September, 1806, and the 31st year of American independence." End quote. All is well, right? Well, not so much. The next day, at Cheratorisha's lodge, Pike insisted they take down the Spanish flag, which had been given them just a few weeks prior. And he wanted him instead to hoist the American flag. When the chief essentially ignored him, Pike insisted again. This time he said, quote, "It was impossible for the nation to have two fathers, that they must either be the children of the Spaniards or acknowledge their American father." End quote. After a very tense moment when not a single Indian spoke for some time, or even seemed to breathe, an elderly Pawnee, according to Pike, quote, "rose, went to the door, and took down the Spanish flag, and brought it and laid it at my feet, and then received the American flag and elevated it on the staff, which had lately borne the standard of His Catholic Majesty." End quote. At this, the Osage and Kansas people seemed to smile and be relieved, but the Pawnees, as Pike puts it, every single face in the council became clouded with sorrow, as if some great national calamity was about to befall them. Realizing he may have pushed it a little too far, Pike picked up the Spanish flag and told them, quote, that as they had now shown themselves dutiful children in acknowledging their great American father, I did not wish to embarrass them when the Spaniards, for it was the wish of the Americans that their red brethren should remain peaceably around their own fires, and not embroil themselves in any disputes between the white people, and that for fear the Spaniards might return there in force again, I returned them their flag, but with an injunction that it should never be hoisted during our stay. End quote. Now, it really had been a close call. If the Spanish arrived to see the American flag, they might punish the Pawnee. After these words, there was a general shout of applause. Pike would later write in his own journal that he, quote, probably was carrying the pride of nations a little too far. There had so lately been a large force of Spanish cavalry at the village, which had made a great impression on the minds of the young men as to their power, consequence, etc., which my appearance with 20 infantry was by no means calculated to remove. End quote. Now, he was right about that too. The Spanish force had been very large, over 500, and they had come with many, many gifts, a lot more than the Americans brought, which shouldn't surprise anyone since the Spanish had been in the area for hundreds of years by this point. They knew how to deal with these people on the plains. They left horses instead of asking for them, first of all, but the Spanish had also left word for the Pawnee. 2 days after the flag fiasco, Chertorish told Pike that the Spanish, when they had recently been in the village, they had wanted to proceed further east into American territory. But the chief forbade it and turned them back. But before they left, the Spanish asked that the chief in turn not allow any Americans to travel further west, especially not to Santa Fe. The chief and his warriors were to turn them back by force of arms if necessary. When Pike was told this, he angrily said he, the chief, quote, must know that the young warriors of his great American father were not women to be turned back by words, and that I should therefore proceed. If he thought proper to stop me, he could attempt it, but we were men, well armed, and would sell our lives at a dear rate to his nation, that we knew our great father would send our young warriors there to gather our bones and revenge our deaths on his people, when our spirits would rejoice in hearing our exploits sung in the war songs of our chief. End quote. It was quite the eloquent threat. But it was not a threat that the chief took seriously. After this meeting, the following day, Pike was informed by the Kansas people that earlier, Chertorish had loudly proclaimed to his people his intention of stopping the Americans from proceeding west with force. Apparently, Pike took this threat about as seriously as the chief had taken his threats, although he did have quote-unquote considerable perturbation of mind. After his men learned of this threat, they apparently talked some big smack talk at the Indians, which made Zeb laugh. And then later that day, the tension between the red and the white men began to rise considerably. So much so that later in the night, a group of warriors on horseback had ridden hard, whooping and ready for war. They'd ridden straight towards the Americans' camp. But they halted and turned back at the last second when the Americans trained their guns on them. Not to mention all day, while they were trying to get some horses, they were refused. Horses were not given, they weren't bartered for, they weren't even able to buy them from the Pawnees. And Pike adds 2 exclamation marks to this annoyance in the journal. Pike would proceed to write a letter after all of this to the Secretary of State, Henry Dearborn. In the letter, he would tell him about the Spanish and how they were trying to strike fear into the hearts of the Indians if they sided with the states. He then complained about the quote-unquote future prospects of the voyage because, quote, the savages strive to throw every impediment in our way, agreeably to the orders received from the Spaniards. End quote. How did the Spaniards know about the coming American exploratory expedition? Well, 2 years prior, when Jefferson was conceiving of these 8 ventures to the west, none other than Wilkinson had written a letter to the Spanish governor of West Florida. This governor then forwarded the letter to the Commandant General in Chihuahua. In this letter, Wilkinson laid out Jefferson's Lewis and Clark plan and amazingly advised the Spanish to, quote, detach a sufficient body of chasseurs, or light cavalry, to intercept Captain Lewis and his party, who are on the Missouri River, and force them to retire or take them prisoners. End quote. I mean, that is amazing. But it gets worse. He also wrote to Spain that pretty soon there would also be an expedition sent to look for the headwaters of the Arkansas and Red Rivers. That's Zeb's mission. He wrote that if they were successful, the Americans, quote, they will very quickly explore the right path which will lead them to the capital of Santa Fe. End quote. Again, this is Zeb's exact mission. Obviously, Pike did not know that his trusted friend and boss was a double or triple agent. Although, curiously, Wilkinson did inform Zeb of a vast, secret Spanish spy network that would be aware of all these expeditions heading west. A network he himself was a part of, Wilkinson. But he didn't tell Zeb that. And truthfully, Wilkinson probably inflated this spy network so as to take blame away from himself. He may have been the sole spy. I'm not sure about that. Well, the Spanish took this threat seriously, and 2 successive governors of New Mexico sent 4 military campaigns north to intercept Lewis and Clark. They really wanted to catch the 2, arrest them, and take everything they recorded. It's amazing Lewis and Clark were able to complete their mission, The first of these punitive missions was sent in August of 1804, and it had 52 men. These men would eventually reach this very same Pawnee village that Pike was having trouble with now. When the Spanish arrived, they were only 150 miles south of Lewis and Clark, but since they had no idea where those two were and their men were, the soldiers focused on the Pawnees and other nations loyal instead. Vial, the leader of this expedition, even told the Pawnees, quote, not to give up the Spanish medals, telling them they still do not know the Americans, but in the future they will. End quote. Vial then took 12 Pawnees back with him to Santa Fe. This was so they can get more gifts from the New Mexican governor. The next mission from the Spanish ended in failure when they were attacked by an unknown group of Indians. Maybe Indians? Vial wasn't sure. He only knew they wore red, white, and blue, and they were good shots. They neither spoke any Indian, nor did they do any whooping. The third mission ended with desertion. The fourth mission, which left on June 15th, 1806, had 400 New Mexican militiamen and 100 Puebloan warriors, and they were led by a man named Melgares, a man who will become important in future episodes. Important, and an eventual friend, it turns out, to Pike. But Melgares' nearly 500-strong force were the Spanish, who had just left only weeks prior to Pike's arrival. They had not been searching for Pike, mind you. They had no idea he was even in the field. They were looking for Lewis and Clark, although Melgares will later claim he was indeed looking for Pike. And I'm still not sure if he was or not. I don't believe he was, but he might have been. While in the village, Pike was given a description of these soldiers, Spanish soldiers. He wrote to Wilkinson that, quote, their infantry was armed with muskets and bayonets, and had drums. The men wore long mustaches and whiskers, which almost covered the whole of their faces. Their cavalry were armed with swords and pistols, and regular guards and patrols were kept by horse and foot. End quote. And it was these Spaniards who had impressed upon the Pawnees the importance of not letting any further Americans go westward. Therefore, all of this loyalty fiasco that was costing Pike during his mission, which he had been sent on by Wilkinson, all of this trouble with the Pawnees was caused by Wilkinson. He wanted to establish, Wilkinson did, an empire in which he would sit on the throne. That empire consisted of invading Santa Fe from the plains. Pike wrote Wilkinson on October 6th and said, quote, if all the route to Santa Fe should be of the same description in case of war, I would pledge my life, and what is infinitely dearer, my honor, for the successful march of a reasonable body of troops into the province of New Mexico. End quote. This again gives away the game. Pike mentioned specifically Santa Fe in his letter. If his mission wasn't to Santa Fe, why would he even write it down? In the Burr trial in 1807, after the Burr affair was uncovered, an associate of Wilkinson's was put on the stand, and he gave testimony under oath that when he asked Wilkinson where Pike was going, this was a few days before Pike had even left, Wilkinson responded with, quote, the object was Santa Fe, that his route would be by land from the Osage towns in order to treat with several nations of Indians by which he would pass. End quote. When this man asked Wilkinson if Pike had been sent by the government, Wilkinson responded with, quote, no, that it was his own plan, and if Mr. Pike succeeded, he, the general, would be placed beyond the reach of his enemies, and that in the course of 18 months he would be in a situation, if the plan succeeded, to call his damned foes to account for their deeds. End quote. Pike knew he was sent to spy, but he thought it was on behalf of the United States, not Wilkinson and Burr's future empire. The next few days, the 5th and the 6th, did see some horses being traded. 2 French traders also arrived to the village. They were there to buy horses. There's no indication in the journal if they were able to buy any. But they did tell the group, Pike's group, of Lewis and Clark's success, which, quote, diffused general joy through our party, end quote. It had been a close call for Lewis and Clark, clearly, although they had no idea the Spanish had been so close or even after them. On the 5th and 6th of October, Pike and his men were able to purchase some horses, and by the 7th of October, after another 12 days in an Indian village, Pike and his expedition were finally ready to set out west again. But before he left, he met with the chief one final time. The meeting was extremely tense. Pike had placed his men outside of their camp in formation and told them only to fire when the Indians got within 5 or 6 paces. Meanwhile, 400 warriors were standing around with their bows and arrows, tomahawks and spears. Eventually, when Pike mounted up, the chief, unarmed, approached him and said, quote, I respect you. I love you as my son. Charatarish loves brave men. Do not oblige me to hurt my son. You must not. You cannot pass that way. End quote. In response, Pike pointed to the sky and said, Brave chief and respected friend, when the sun reaches yon point in his daily journey, I and my brave comrades here will then start, and nothing but death can stop us. It is my duty. If you think it is yours to obey the Spaniard, so to stop me, be it so. But be assured that the attempt will cost the lives of many brave men. This you may be sure of. End quote. After he had said this, the warriors began knocking their arrows. Pike grabbed the hilt of his sword, but he kept the sword in its scabbard. He had earlier told his men that the signal to fire was him drawing his sword. After a few heart-poundingly tense moments, the chief told Pike, quote, Brave young chief, you are free to pursue your journey. Were I now to stop you by destroying you and your comrades, I should feel myself a coward. Behold, the sun and blue sky have met. Farewell, my son. May the Great Spirit guide and protect you. End quote. Pike took his hand off his sword, thanked the chief, and then set off to the west. Once up on a hill, overlooking the Pawnee village, Zeb wrote this in his journal, quote, When I was once on the summit of the hill which overlooks the village, I felt my mind as if relieved from a heavy burden. Yet all the evil I wished the Pawnees was that I might be the instrument in the hands of our government to open their ears and eyes with a strong hand, to convince them of our power. End quote. In the next episode, Zebulon Montgomery Pike will continue to fulfill his mission as he heads for the headwaters of the Arkansas and Red Rivers in the mighty Mexican mountains in the dead of winter. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.
Came down from Alamosa, across the Rio Grande, the track a killer lion, lost his fear of man. First seen around El Rito, he laid a rancher down, killed the rancher's daughter, was gone out of sound. Purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Not much trace of man out here, the painted canyon walls, the ancient pagan hunters showed the chase and fall. Now the lever-action rifle, horses change the game, but their ghosts still hunt beside me. The chase still feels the same. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the hounds my father left me are ranging out of sight. I stand up in my saddle in the early morning light. I can see the good gyp circle, and I know it won't be long till the canyon rings are striking cry, the lion will be found. Yet the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Finds a lonely juniper to make his final stand. 3 faithful hounds lie dying, blood shining on the sand. And the good gyp leaps up in the air, as low as murder charge. My rifle cracks, a whisper late, I can feel his iron jaw. The purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the eagle sees us falling, the hunter and the prey. His shadow crosses lifeless bodies, where side by side we lay. And the good gyp sits upon the rim, and all alone she cries a death song for her master, killed the mighty lion. Purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Yeah, the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds.